Welcome back. It's time now for The World This Week here on France 24 in partnership with The Daily Beasts. And as ever, we're taking a look back at some of the week's top news stories. We're keeping a very close eye at the moment on what's happening in Washington. That's the scene where a North Korean envoy has just arrived, a senior envoy, with a letter believed to be written by Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, addressed to the US President Donald Trump. And it's widely expected that that letter is going to put the on-again, off-again nuclear summit between the two leaders, which had been scheduled for June the 12th in Singapore, back on track. These pictures coming into us from the White House, where it's believed the envoy has just arrived, carrying that letter. He is expected to deliver it personally to the US President Donald Trump. It's a letter that Donald Trump said that he was expecting to receive. It comes, of course, in response to a letter that he sent to North Korea saying that the summit was off. Well, to discuss that and a number of other topics, I'm joined here in the studio by Christopher Dickey, who is, of course, the foreign editor at The Daily Beast. Welcome back. Pierre Aski, who is a journalist and the president of Reporters Without Borders. Welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. Marc Bassets is the Paris correspondent for the Spanish newspaper El País. Welcome to you. And Alyssa Rubin is the Paris bureau chief for the New York Times. Welcome to you. Let me start with you, of course, because I introduced you last. That was very rude of me. This, of course, happening in Washington. What's your hunch? That letter basically means that the summit's back on, doesn't it?
Well, I think what we've seen over the last few weeks with Donald Trump on a whole variety of issues, not just the North Korea nuclear situation, but also his messaging on trade, is that he is still going back and forth on a lot of things, and he's still supposedly negotiating these trade tariffs. I am not sure what he wants to see exactly in that letter, and I think I don't know that what's in the letter will even matter. He has a list of things, and if he doesn't get that, if he doesn't see it as somehow making him look strong and Kim look weak, I think it's going to be a very difficult situation.
Let me just ask you, Christopher, do you get the impression Donald Trump's sort of a little bit out of his depth on this one? I mean, North Korea is an extremely unpredictable country. Kim Jong-un is pretty much an unknown entity. Should he be meeting him?
Well, only if he wants to give Kim Jong-un the amount of prestige that you get from meeting with the American president. If you're, the leader of what's called the Hermit Kingdom, probably the most notorious human rights abusing country in the world, and one that has a desperately poor economy, but does have nuclear weapons, the message is, you can be horrible, you can be poor, but if you have nukes, the president of the United States will meet you. And Kim is playing Trump very, very skillfully because he knows that Trump's ego is now totally wrapped up in this. And the summit is hugely important for Trump as a measure of his ego. For Kim, it's classic diplomacy. If you can meet somebody like the President of the United States and be treated as an equal, coming from where he's coming from, you've already won. That's a victory. And that's exactly what he's going to get if there is a summit in Singapore that then leads to another meeting and protracted negotiations. That's why I'm sure Pompeo and the other people who are the serious people trying to deal with this, they want to get it all nailed down before they go. They want a clear, unequivocal commitment to denuclearization, not talk about denuclearization. I don't think they're going to get that.
They won't have it. I think the whole ambiguity is about the word denuclearization, as your correspondent pointed out. And I don't think the clarification is in that letter. And I don't think it's in Kim's interest to clarify it, because he is the king of ambiguity on that subject. And he knows that Trump wants the summit, needs the summit. He also wants to have that summit because it's a recognition from the leader of the first superpower. And so they will both have the summit without the expected result. Because I don't see how Kim, at this stage, can give up on nuclear weapons, which three generations of Kims have developed over a period of 50 years. It's
kept them safe, hasn't it? It's kept them from any hostile
and the whole
external force.
And the whole confusion about the summit started when John Bolton used the reference of Libya, which is the worst reference that he could use, because when Gaddafi gave up his nuclear ambitions, a few years later, he was killed. So he was toppled and killed. And so that's the worst nightmare that Kim Jong-un could have.
And I think there's also just an enormous distance between what Trump and Bolton want and what is even possible. If you look at what was attained on the Iran agreement, it took years and years and years of work to get something very incremental, but substantive. To get anything that you can boast about that is clear is going to be really hard for Trump.
Well, and why on earth would Kim trust Donald Trump to keep his word on this? Why would anybody trust America to live up to its end of these bargains? Now, Kim has something solid, tangible, nuclear weapons. Trump is offering him promises. Gee, I don't know. Is that a good trade-off if you're Kim? I don't think so.
We'll have to see. I just want to ask you, you've been very quiet there, Mark, and of course this is not necessarily front page news, is it, for El País? You've got another story which is going to be front page news. We're going to talk about that in just a moment, but is this likely to make it to pages 3, 5 or 7, do you think, of El País tomorrow?
Of course it is. Everybody's following it. I think that Trump, as you said, wants the summit, but he also wants the show. We are analyzing Trump in the classic diplomatic terms. He's a reality show guy. He's put, I don't remember a letter arriving in the White House with so many journalists and cameras following the letter arriving. He's just a great showman. We have to admit it. He's keeping us in suspense to know what happened with this letter, which at the end of the day, we don't know what will happen and what impact will it have on this whole issue. He's saying there is a summit, there is no summit. It's a great episode for him.
Yeah, it's a difficult story to follow because we can't even see the letter, so it's difficult to it's difficult to get too excited about it.
What language is it in? I mean,
We see the postman.
We can see the postman.
And you don't know what part Trump will choose to read. There's no guarantee you're going to hear the whole letter, or you're going to hear a fragment, or none of it.
Well, it exists, we gather,
Right.
and it should now be in the White House, so perhaps the US president is reading it. Let's go on to a different story, trade tariffs, which took effect at midnight on Friday. Duties of 25% and 10% have been slapped on imports of aluminium and steel from the EU, Canada and Mexico, raising the prospects of a global trade war and sparking anger. Well, this is dumb, said one Republican senator. An assault on our allies, said a former trade advisor in the administration of George W. Bush. And the EU has struck back at the US, filing a complaint at the World Trade Organization and promising a series of countermeasures of its own. Well, we can listen now to what the EU Trade Commissioner Cecilia Malmström had to say about it.
If players in the world do not stick to the rule book, the system might collapse. And that is why we are challenging today both the US and China at the WTO, and it demonstrates that we are not choosing any sides. We stand for the multilateral system, for a rule-based global trade.
Okay, an EU Trade Commissioner speaking there. Let me just put this to you, Christopher. Why is Washington doing this to its closest friends?
well, I think, it's not only to our closest friends in Europe. He's also screwing his own constituency in lots of states, including South Carolina, my home state, where German cars are manufactured. He wants to ban German cars. BMW exports from South Carolina 270,000 cars to the rest of the world. So it's a big, complicated situation, and he doesn't really understand it, but he does know that it will appeal to his constituents, at least initially, to say, the world is screwing us, I'm going to screw them back. And that's exactly the way he deals with things. In terms of real negotiations, he also always takes a maximalist point of view. I'm going to really kill you. I'm going to crush you. And then it comes back to, yeah, well, okay, we can accept this deal. It's a little bit like what he's doing with North Korea. And I think that that's exactly what he's doing with Europe. He says, sit up and take notice because I'm going to take extreme measures, then we'll talk about it.
Alyssa, basically he's doing what he said he's going to do, isn't he? He promised he was going to do this and he's following through. So at least one thing is clear with President Trump is that when he says he's going to do something, he does actually follow through quite a lot of the time.
Well, I think he certainly wants that message to get out to particularly to his followers and to his base, that he's a man who is good to his word. But trade is probably one of the most complex areas to wade into, every bit as much as nuclear, denuclearization or anything like that, because almost everything you make, as Chris said, it's not like you're just going to use American products or you're going to be able to somehow segregate all the parts. So there's so many cross-cutting interests here. And if Mexico, which is now threatening to put all kinds of tariffs on food products, for instance, stop sending tomatoes to the United States, just to take something random, but something that's a major element of our food processing, that has all kinds of effects on business too. And for farmers, it's an enormous burden, which are also his constituencies. So he's making good on a promise, and he's getting the political mileage out of that. But there's been no real looking at how it could backfire.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, Pierre, I mean, do you get the impression that, first of all, Washington has actually thought this through in terms of possible reprisals, and do you also get the impression that, basically EU, Canada, and Mexico, they're not going to take this lying down, are they?
Well, you remember the tweet that Donald Trump sent a few weeks ago that trade wars are good and easy to win, and so if that's what he really thinks, we're all in deep trouble. The question is, the situation is getting worse than the Europeans imagined at first, because many people, although they didn't like Trump and they were wary of what he was going to do, thought that with time, with grown-ups around him, he would get quieter on certain issues. He's done, the number of conflicts between the US and Europe now is getting bigger and bigger between the Paris climate agreement, Iran recently, Jerusalem.
He's torn up every rule book, hasn't he?
And now the trade war, this is getting a lot. And the problem is that Europe is in such a bad shape politically at the moment that it has very limited options to fight back.
Yeah.
And as we've seen on Iran, Europe says, okay, we want to keep the deal alive, but they have no means of protecting big companies. And Total, for example, the French oil company, has already announced that it was giving up on its Iran project. Sure. And gave the deal to China, which makes the American strategy even harder to understand.
Sure, and I was just looking actually, Mark, I mean, the list of countermeasures that the Europeans are putting together, they're talking about steel products, whiskey, peanut butter, motorcycles and jeans. I mean, it sounds a little bit desperate, doesn't it, on the part of the Europeans, if that's the best they can come up with?
Well, Donald Trump is testing Europe. And if Donald Trump really wants a war, I think that the European Union should respond accordingly. For instance, I'm not an expert, I must say I'm not an expert on trade policy, but why don't they look at constituencies of Congress persons who are up for re-election in the next midterms and try to hit them hard? Republicans, let's say, this is politics, this is trade war. So I wonder if the European Union is getting ready to take this challenge that
which is what China is doing. China has been listing the products that come from the constituencies of Donald Trump's followers that are at stake.
And so is I believe Germany and France have both talked about bourbon, which is from Senator McConnell's.
Well, hell, Nikki Haley comes from South Carolina.
We're going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry to cut you all short. That's all we have time for the first half. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes, and The World This Week will continue. Welcome back to The World This Week. Just before the break, we were talking about North Korea. We're also talking about trade tariffs. Let's move on to another subject a little bit closer to us here in France, because in the Grand Hall of the Quirinale Palace in Rome today, the Italian president, Sergio Mattarella, has today sworn in what is Western Europe's first populist government, and in the process ended 3 months of political deadlock. Well, at the helm of that new government is a new Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, as well as a mixture of anti-establishment and right-wing ministers, amongst them members of the Eurosceptic Five-Star Movement and members of the anti-immigrant right-wing League, which is vowing to expel hundreds of thousands of migrants. Well, on Thursday, the EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker made what was seen as disparaging comments about Italy, telling Italians to stop blaming Europe and, I quote, do more work and less corruption.
I'm in deep love with Italy, Bella Italia, but I'm no longer accepting that everything which is going wrong in south of Italy, Mezzogiorno, is explained by the fact that the European Union or the European Commission would not do enough. Italians have to take care of the poorer regions of Italy. That means more work, less corruption, seriousness. We will help them, as we always did, but don't play this game.
Okay, Jean-Claude Juncker speaking there. Well, the leader of the League, Matteo Salvini, has hit back at Juncker, accusing him of being rude and making sweeping generalizations about his country.
Someone who is paid to govern Italians as well cannot call 60 million people corrupt. Maybe in Europe they're used to people holding the hat out begging for money. But I'm sure that this new government will carry out its priorities in a well-educated manner, with sobriety, in order to make Italy a protagonist in Europe once again. As we don't have to be jealous of anybody.
Okay, the leader of the League there, hitting back at Jean-Claude Juncker. So by the looks of things, things haven't got off to a brilliant start, have they really? Because Europe looking with quite a lot of alarm at what's happening there in Italy. You've been very quiet, Mark. Let me just turn to you. I mean, what are your thoughts about what this new government in Italy is planning and is able to achieve?
Well, the new we must say first that this new government is much more moderate than the previous one that they tried to do, and the president of Italy said no. So this has several technocrats who are in the new government of Italy, even if it's formed by populist and nationalist parties. I think it's a government. It seems acceptable to Brussels and to the much feared markets who punished the previous government that they try to build. So I would say, perhaps being a little bit against the current, let's not be too apocalyptic in this first moment. Italy has a government. These parties won the election. The Northern League, a few days ago, their goal was to have a new election and to have an overwhelming victory, which could have built a much more radical government. So let's wait and see. It's dangerous in any way that the authorities in Brussels make fires, where they are known. I think they are helping these people, like the Northern League, with the kind of declarations that Juncker did in the last hours.
Yeah.
It's been the 73rd political crisis in 70 years in Italy, and some Italians I've spoken to say, let's wait for the 74th crisis, because no one believes this coalition, which has produced a program within a few days because they were not allied in the elections, that this program is very credible. And so there are two options. One is that the whole thing collapses quite quickly because of egos, because of disagreements, because of unrealistic proposals in their program, or they have as a prospect to win the next elections within a few months or within the next year. And that could be another option. But whatever happens, the problem is that Europe is paralyzed by that. Italy is one of the founder members. The treaty was signed in Rome, the founding treaty of the European Community back then. And Macron had great expectations for his plans to revamp Europe. He had been waiting for Merkel to form her coalition. And once the German coalition has been formed after 9 months of negotiations, you have these crises erupting in Italy with this Eurosceptic government. You have Spain, we'll talk about Spain, which has a globally pro-European government, but with a very fragile majority and probably unable to make big decisions on the future of Europe. So the problem is the impact of this crisis on Italy and on Europe.
Okay, well, to quote Christopher Dickey, we'll just have to wait and see on that one. And you mentioned Spain. We've been talking about the situation in the Eurozone's third largest economy. Meanwhile, in the Eurozone's fourth largest economy, Spain, of course, there's a new prime minister. That's after the prime minister of 6.5 years, Mariano Rajoy, was forced out of office. That followed on from a no-confidence vote in parliament earlier on today. Well, the socialist leader is Pedro Sánchez. He takes the reign, promising to fix what he called social emergencies in the country. The result, he says, of austerity measures. Let me turn, first of all, to you, Mark, because, of course, you are the correspondent for El País newspaper. I mean, we've been saying that Europe a little bit worried about what's happening in Italy. Do you get the impression they're rather less worried about what's happening in Spain?
Obviously, much less worried, because first, as you said, the Socialist Party in Spain is a strongly pro-European party with a tradition of Europe. You said Europeanism or pro-Europe stance that goes back to decades ago. Felipe González, the famous Prime Minister of Spain, was one of the big European men in the 80s and 90s. So there is no doubt that the new Spanish government will be pro-European and pro-Euro. It's interesting to see that in Spain, we don't have an Eurosceptic party. There's no Eurosceptic party. Even the left, we can call them leftist populist, they are not explicitly anti-European or Eurosceptic. So in this side, it's a completely different situation than Italy.
What do we think? A loss to the country? Mariano Rajoy going that? He's been there for 6.5 years. He says he's left the country in a better state than he found it in when he took office 6.5 years ago. Is that true? Do you think he'll be missed?
Well, all the the Spanish president or prime ministers, they live in a bad situation and being hated by everybody. This is a tradition. With the time, they are being rehabilitated. So it's a question of the legacy. He's trying to start to write his legacy. So perhaps there is a case to say that, well, he dealt with a big financial crisis, and Spain didn't need finally the bailout that other Southern European countries needed, because he applied rigorously the economic policies that the European Central Bank and Germany and Brussels were dictating. Well, we'll see in the next time. But the reality is that today he's unpopular. His party has had a big corruption case that has damaged him a lot. And finally, it's the first time that in a non-confidence vote, a prime minister is ousted in Spain, in democratic Spain.
It will be interesting to see how the new government is going to handle the Catalonia story, because in the vote today, the Catalan vote was key to get a majority to oust Rajoy. So what is going to happen in trying to get out of the crisis that has been going on for a few months? It's a big question mark for the near future.
Yes, a lot of interesting things occurred during the debate and the voting. And one of them is that the Catalan independentist parties who have people now in prison or who have people in other countries because they are sought by the Spanish justice, they voted for Pedro Sánchez, the new socialist prime minister. And Pedro Sánchez, in his speech and his interventions, he advocated for dialogue. And this could be a change in the stance of Madrid, even if the Socialist Party had a very loyal position during the crisis in the last months, and he was aligned with the Popular Party. But there are some hints that this could bring a new mood in Spain and in Catalonia.
Yeah, he sort of came out of nowhere, didn't he, really, in a way, Pedro Sanchez? He's a former economics professor, I believe. He's quite young. I mean, what are your thoughts, Alyssa? Do you think he looks like someone who is capable of doing all of these really quite challenging things that lie ahead of him, not least this Catalan separatist issue?
Well, I think on the Catalan problem, it having been there sort of last year a bit when it was very controversial. One thing that was really unpopular that Rajoy did was send out the police and have them intervene in a way that looked, depending on who you listen to, very violent or anyway somewhat violent. And I think anyone who reaches out and attempts to engage and have some kind of negotiation is much more likely to make headway and at least to keep the country together for longer while they're talking. If you just say no, it precipitates conflict. So I think that is probably a good sign, at least for the short term.
Well, also Rajoy, whose party is sort of descended from the old Franquista fascist party, you know, he played into all the wrong memes, all the wrong images in Catalonia. Once you bring out the police and have them beating people who are trying to vote, it just doesn't look good, even if you're not a partisan in favor of the independence of Catalonia. So I think people felt that he handled that in a very clumsy way. But he was trying to look tough for his constituency. In the end, that didn't save him.
So we think that high-handed tactics in dealing with that issue has actually played to the advantage of, well, basically brought about the appearance of Sanchez on the scene. I mean, without that, do you think that Sanchez would have perhaps stood a chance, or was that a key factor in propelling him into the forefront?
No, I don't think it's a key factor. The key factor was corruption. And let's not forget, the party who is growing in Spain and who is number one in the opinion polls is Ciudadanos, which is even more hardline than the Popular Party of Rajoy in the Catalonia issue. So Ciudadanos thinks that Rajoy was too soft on Catalonia. And this is the party who will be now in the opposition, but who aims to be in government in the near time. This is the party who is trying to substitute the Popular Party of Rajoy in the opposition. One big question now is how long will this government last? It's a minority government. They have 84, I think, members of parliament. It's not. He cannot have a solid majority, and many people, among them obviously Ciudadanos, who think they can win an election, they are calling for elections as soon as possible.
But otherwise, the election has to be held in 2020. Is that right? In Spain, is it likely there'll be an election before then, or will he do everything he can, Sanchez, to avoid that and get into the groove, so to speak, as prime minister?
It's very difficult to say because 48 hours ago. Very few people would have said that Sanchez would be now well, tomorrow I think it will be the day the Prime Minister of Spain. But it's extremely difficult to survive for 2 years without a coalition and a majority.
It's all happened very fast, hasn't it?
But there's also a generational change here, isn't there? I mean, Sanchez is young, the leadership of Podemos is young, the leadership of Ciudadanos is young. They're all a much younger generation than Rajoy. So I think and they're all more or less unknown quantities.
And what's interesting in both cases, Italy and Spain, is that part of the coalition is made by people who came from outside the system, the Five Star in Italy or Podemos in Spain, people who have come as disruptors of the political system and who are now part of governing coalitions, and they are really an unknown quantity in terms of managing public affairs. So we'll have to see how they behave in government.
Okay, let's move on now, because we've got one last topic to discuss, because Paris has got a new tourist attraction. It is a 6-story apartment building in the 18th arrondissement, where visitors and Parisians alike have been flocking these past few days to take selfies, because it was here that a real-life Spiderman was sighted last weekend. Mamoudou Gassama scaled that building with his bare hands and rescued a 4-year-old boy who was about to fall off a balcony. And since then, the life of the 22-year-old hero, who is a Malian migrant who arrived in this country illegally less than a year ago, has changed beyond all recognition. Let me ask you, Pierre, because you are, of course, from here.
I'm the Frenchman of the
What do you think it was about this story that captured not just France's attention, but the attention of the entire world?
Well, first of all, it was filmed, which is an important part of the story. And today, if you don't have images, you don't have a story. And those images were very spectacular. The way he climbed so quickly, rescued this boy. So I think that really was the first element. The second one is obviously that this guy is such a symbol, a strong symbol of today's European crisis with the migrant situation. You have this guy who is an illegal migrant living in the country and who becomes overnight a hero, gets his documents and is recruited by the fire brigade. I mean, this is a fairy tale, you know. And so there's a lot of hypocrisy there, obviously. Everybody's happy for him. He's a real hero. He should have been rewarded and so on. But at the same time, this comes at a time when the French government is toughening its immigration policy. The Minister of Interior, Gérard Collomb, who is conducting that policy, is really a tough anti-immigration minister, even if the government is trying to keep a softer overall attitude. But certainly the signal is that immigration is being restricted. And all of a sudden you have this man who takes the fast track. And so there is a lot of ambiguity on the whole topic. And I must say I'm happy for him because he's done something great and good. But it's just a shining moment in a gloomy situation.
Well, I think if he hadn't been filmed, he'd be liable to be deported.
He might still be an illegal immigrant.
Yeah, he would still be an illegal immigrant.
What are your thoughts about how this is all played out in the media and how the president has handled this?
Well, I think the president has tried to milk it as he often does for the moment, the photo
so
moment.
Quick, wasn't he?
Was very quick, yes. And he was certainly aware of the enormous contrast between the Malian and his very informal clothes and his own suit, and he was able to do something that looked generous when he is being accused in many quarters, whether that's has to do with labor laws or how he's treating the elderly or anything, or certainly how he's treating immigrants as taking things away. Here he was able to show himself as giving everything to this man. But I think part of it was that there's great longing for a clear, good story, and for many people, it's nice to see a hero. But thank God there are not too many children falling off balconies, because you'd have an enormous number of immigrants attempting to climb up to try to get into France.
Go there.
No, but I mean it's obviously terribly arbitrary. And
some commentators saying, not just Parisians and not just French people, the whole of Europe, take a page out of his book because he's modest and he's brave. And maybe those are things that we're sort of losing in our own society in a way. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Mark?
I agree, and I think that precisely President Macron recognized that. Macron is trying to write a narrative of the French République through heroes. It's not the first hero in his short presidency. We had the gendarme, if you remember, a couple of months ago in southern France, who gave his life for another person, and he lost his life effectively. He was the first hero of the Macron era, and I put this in relation with the immigrant. So we had the military hero, and now we had the immigrant, which it's a lesson. He uses that like in a classroom, a lesson to the French citizens. Look, he's an immigrant. He's a good person. He is altruist. He didn't do that for the papers, obviously. So I think in a little bit it's through hypocritical way, because the laws are very strict and are getting tougher. He's trying to tell something to France and perhaps to the world.
Okay, go ahead. You got the last word.
Many people also argue that to come from Mali to France as an illegal immigrant crossing Libya and the Mediterranean Sea and all the borders is quite a heroic act, right. and that a lot of people have gone through such a hardship in that traveling of illegal immigrants that recognizing one is a very ambiguous situation.
Sure. Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Pierre Esqui. You've had the last word. Thank you so much. Thanks to you for watching The World This Week. it's time now for Media Watch, and Emma James is just pottering into the studio.
Indeed.
Hi, Emma. We're
making
gonna
reference
start
to my
by
high
talking-
heels.
The high heels, I didn't see that. A TV issue that's got a lot of people up in arms, really, in the United States, including, it would appear, the president himself.
Yes, absolutely. And it's really brought a particular US comedian to global attention, this one. Samantha Bee is her name. She fronts a show called Full Frontal. She's known in the US as being very aggressive, combative, really the voice of the resistance, if you like, against Donald Trump. But is she funny? Well, this is what she said the other night, which is what has riled up so many people. Take a look.
Ivanka, that's a beautiful photo of you and your child, but let me just say, one mother to another, do something about your dad's immigration practices, you feckless. He listens to you.
So there you go. For obvious reasons, we've bleeped out the word, which begins with a C. And I think most people admit that she has crossed a line, perhaps, with this one in terms of good taste, just as Roseanne Barr did. But a lot of people are saying the two have been treated very, very differently. Donald Trump has jumped into this because, of course, after all, Samantha Bee was talking about his daughter. Why aren't they firing no-talent Samantha Bee for the horrible language used on her low-rating show? A total double standard, but that's OK. We are winning, he says. Now, of course, the double standard that he's really referring to is Roseanne Barr, who lost her show earlier this week. She apologised. It didn't save the show. Samantha Bee has apologised, and TBS, the channel that it's on, have said that they are going to stand by her and actually feel that they made a mistake too in allowing this to happen. She says, I would like to sincerely apologise to Ivanka Trump and to my viewers for using an expletive on my show to describe her last night. It was inappropriate and inexcusable. I crossed a line and I deeply regret it. And it really is the one word, I think, that pretty much everyone in the world can agree on, that you just don't use it. You certainly don't use it on television unless you want a very strong backlash. But backlash there is, no matter what. And Fox News, unsurprisingly, talking about the supposed double standard between the way she's been treated as opposed to Roseanne Barr. Now, Roseanne Barr tweeted this week about a former aide to the president, former President Barack Obama. A comment, she said she blamed it on Ambien, the sedative, saying she was Ambien tweeting at 2 a.m. But she said that this woman was basically, who is black, I should mention, that she looked like what you would get if you crossed the Muslim Brotherhood with the Planet of the Apes. So obviously very, very different slurs, insults, and people not necessarily all seeing the difference. Megyn Kelly, for one, saying, this is disgusting, how is this acceptable? She says it was right to condemn Roseanne Barr, but it's also right to condemn Samantha Bee too. Now, TBS, as I said, has said she's taken the right action in apologising. They're not going to be pulling her show. One of the most interesting people wading in on this one is Bernice King, the daughter of Martin Luther King, who has said, let's stop calling each other names. Also, let's stop comparing an insult to a dehumanising term used in oppressing black people, because there is a big difference between those two terms and the way in which they should be seen. This Twitter user, I think, is probably the funniest tweet I've seen on this whole subject. Some would argue the double standard is that saying when men speak like that, it is just locker room talk. Of course, Donald Trump said it was just locker room talk when he referred to grabbing women by the same part of the anatomy, just a marginally more polite term for it.
Well, I think I'm going to have to cut you off there, Emma. That's quite enough from you for today's edition of Media Watch. Thank you so much to you. Let me also thank our guests today on The World This Week. Christopher Dickey, thanks to you. Pierre Aski, President of Reporters Without Borders, thank you so much. Mark Bassett, Paris correspondent for El País. And last but not least, Alyssa Rubin, Paris Bureau Chief for The New York Times. Thank you so much indeed. That's it from me. There'll be news at the top of the hour. Don't go away.